Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Mob Museum. My name is Shakayla Alvarenga. Las Vegas was not the first only Sin City. For example, Newport, Kentucky, with its string of illegal gambling clubs outside Cincinnati, earned that title in the 1930s. Another Sin City could be found in a remote Arkansas town, also known for its healing waters, Hot Springs, Arkansas. The history of this Sin City of the Bible Belt is the subject our speaker will address tonight. David Hill, an Arkansas native, has written a great book called The Vapors, A Southern Family, The New York Mob, and the Rise and Fall of Hot Springs, America's Forgotten Capital of Vice. The book delves deeply into organized crime's history in Hot Springs, which includes well-known names such as Owney Madden, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Al Capone. But Hill's portrait of Hot Springs casts a wider net, covering everything from racial politics to professional baseball. After Mr. Hill's talk, he will take some questions from you, and he will also be signing books. We do have a limited number of copies of his book available for purchase. And with that being said, please join me in welcoming Mr. David Hill.
Thank you very much. And thanks to Shakayla and to the Mob Museum and all the staff here for putting this on. Perhaps the only thing more unbelievable than the fact that America's Monte Carlo or gambling capital, its sort of only world-class international tourist destination is in the middle of this desert here, is the fact that it was almost in the middle of the Bible Belt in the American South, in Hot Springs, Arkansas. Hot Springs has been called many things over the years: the Valley of the Vapors, the Sin City of the South, the loose buckle on the Bible Belt. But beginning in its heyday around the middle of the last century, and really still today, it was called by those who frequented it the Spa. And the gangsters who used to hang out there like to call it Bubbles. Believe it or not, in the 1950s, as Las Vegas's boom began to sputter a bit, many people looked to Hot Springs as the once and future capital of gambling in America. And I'm going to talk tonight about how that happened, but since we're at the Mob Museum, I'm going to devote most of this time tonight to talking about specifically Hot Springs' connection to organized crime and the role that the mob played in that evolution. But the mob is really just one piece of the story of Hot Springs, and if you want to know the whole story, I think they're selling my book out there in the lobby, so I'd encourage you to buy it. This is a picture from Harper's Magazine in 1878, and in 1878, Harper sent a journalist down from the East Coast to Hot Springs to see what at that point was kind of a bustling community that had grown up around, really in the middle of nowhere. I mean, there were no real easy roads to get to this part of Hot Springs. You can see it's sort of nestled into a valley in the mountains, the Ouachita Mountains there. And even to get there, you had to traverse these like really, really difficult and dangerous roads by stagecoach. But they had been building this community up since the early 1800s. That's when white people really started building camps near the hot springs for the first time. And so what makes this place unique and why they call it Hot Springs is that hot water from inside the earth just sort of bubbles up around there. And the first groups of people that sort of settled in there believed that that water had some kind of healing or medicinal properties. The Civil War really destroyed Hot Springs, not because there were any battles or anything in Hot Springs, but it was because marauders really took over the town when folks were away fighting the Civil War, and it was really difficult to rebuild it because there were a lot of disputes over who owned the land. And eventually the U.S. Supreme Court had to get involved, and in 1876, the Supreme Court ruled that the land was public, and Hot Springs became the first park ever managed by the federal government, well before there was even the idea of a national park or National Park Service, although Hot Springs was eventually designated a national park and is actually America's smallest national park. Once they settled that dispute, reconstruction of Hot Springs happened pretty fast. And people from places as far away as St. Louis or New York, they all came to take these baths to feel healed by this hot water. And when they did feel like they were healed by it, the word spread about what was going on in Hot Springs, and it really developed into quite a respectable resort. But the city that grew there was not just a resort, it was pretty rowdy. And I think that is not that uncommon for spa towns. I mean, not just in America, but around the world. There's other places that had very similar evolutions as hot springs, whether it's Carlsbad or Monte Carlo or Baden-Baden, places where people found this hot water and decided to kind of build a community around it so that folks could bathe in it and experience this water. And around all of those towns developed a community of grifters, of gamblers, of prostitutes, and Hot Springs was no different. It was set upon by all kinds of sordid characters who preyed upon folks who were there visiting Hot Springs to take the baths. The one story is that the mayor of Hot Springs during this time, T.F. Lind, he once shot a newspaper man for writing a critical article about him, and he was never charged, he was never removed from office. I mean, it was real like Deadwood type stuff, and so it's not really any surprise that illegal vice was allowed to flourish and operate in a town like this. But T.F. Lind, the mayor of Hot Springs, really had no real power. The power in Hot Springs belonged to the boss gambler, and the boss gambler back then was a guy named Frank Flynn, who we see here shooting at people. And Frank, the idea of a boss gambler was a key concept in Hot Springs and in really any gambling town in America. And the boss gambler really sort of acted as someone who weighed in on disputes between rival casino or casino owners or gamblers that came through town, made rules that everybody had to follow, and kind of settled beefs. And Frank Flynn was the guy that really kind of became the boss gambler of Hot Springs. But not everybody liked the way that Frank Flynn ran things, and so some rival gambling factions had formed, and they fought a war in the streets of Hot Springs with gunfights, and a lot of people died, not all of them gamblers. Innocent people were killed, and by the end of the 1880s, tourism in Hot Springs was really suffering from the idea that this was really a lawless place. So the people of Hot Springs got kind of tired of Frank Flynn, and they marched on the town square chanting, "Hang every gambler in Hot Springs." And they ran Flynn and all the other gamblers out of town. But eventually, the town ran out of money, and they allowed the casinos to reopen under new management. So this is a cycle that would repeat itself again and again for the next 150 years in this town. By the turn of the century, Hot Springs was really known all over the country, and people called it the American Carlsbad, after the famous German resort. Professional baseball teams like the Chicago Cubs, the Pittsburgh Pirates, and even Babe Ruth and the Boston Red Sox, who were pictured here before they were the Red Sox. I think they were called the Boston Nationals at that point. They did their winter training in Hot Springs because a lot of professional baseball players enjoyed vacationing in Hot Springs. And so they had the idea that they would hold their spring and winter trainings in Hot Springs. And this was really the birth of the idea of spring training in baseball happened in Hot Springs. Hot Springs was so popular that the entire main drag across the street from the row of bathhouses that the federal government was operating on their property, which was called Bathhouse Row, that stretch of road across the street from them was just a bunch of casinos, hotels, and brothels. And by the 19-teens, Hot Springs was just set upon by con artists from all over the country. I mean, this was a big part. This was something that was kind of a big phenomenon in America during that period of time, was these kind of mobs of con artists, gangs of con men that ran big scams that really were sort of national in flavor. And they would steer marks from big cities down to Hot Springs, where they would take them in like crooked games, like crooked clubs like the Indiana Club, which was a casino in Hot Springs at that time, with gaffed roulette wheels, or fake bucket shops with stock scams, or fake horse racing handbooks, like in the movie The Sting. If anybody remembers the scams they ran in The Sting, that was a popular one that was run out of Hot Springs as well. And so they would run these marks from big cities on trains all the way down to Hot Springs by convincing them that there was a scam that they were letting them in on, right? This is kind of the way that a lot of these scams worked, was that the mark that they were putting the touch on felt like they were participating in something illegal, that they were going to get over, but they were going to be able to benefit from a rigged roulette wheel, or they were going to benefit from some insider stock scam. And by the time they got them down to Hot Springs, something went wrong, the scam didn't go wrong, and they lost all their money, and they would never go to the cops because they were committing a crime too. Well, they didn't go to the cops until a guy named Frank Fox, who was a professional race car driver, got taken for $20,000 in Hot Springs, the Indiana Club. And he didn't take it lying down. He hired a detective agency to figure out who was behind it, and it made national headlines. And so once again, Hot Springs was in the news nationally for being kind of a bad place, and tourism was endangered by this bad publicity. So the local leaders decided to let things cool down, and they decided to kind of move the gambling into the back rooms for a while. Now, Prohibition starts in the 1920s, and Prohibition really had the opposite effect on Hot Springs that it was intended to have, because it actually increased the number of bars and saloons in Hot Springs rather than decrease them. This is a funny picture. This is a cartoon in the local paper of a local bar when the day after Prohibition, when the law enforcement was supposed to come and take the beer from the bar owner got a local carnival that was doing their winter quarters in Hot Springs to bring all the elephants, and he let them drink all of his beer out on the street before the cops could get their hands on it. But eventually they just decided to let people drink anyway, and folks, thirsty people far and wide traveled to Hot Springs to drink, and so eventually there were 31 different bars operating in Hot Springs during Prohibition, just openly defiant of the law. This guy, second from the right, that's Leo McLaughlin. And Leo McLaughlin, he's pictured here in the 30s with President Roosevelt in Hot Springs, but he would really set Hot Springs on a path. He would really change Hot Springs in a big way. In 1927, he ran for mayor, and he was elected mayor running on a platform that he was going to run the city wide open. And what wide open meant was that he was going to permit gambling, he was going to permit liquor, he was going to permit prostitution, whatever folks wanted, they could get it in Hot Springs. And he dared the state and the federal government to come down and do anything about it. And he said if folks elected him and he did this, he would tax all of these sinful operations, and he'd use that money to fix up the town. Now this guy is Al Capone. And this is Al in Hot Springs. You can see on his little wagon there, it says, "Traveling through Arkansas, we'll be home soon." That's Al and his wife. Al Capone was one of the people who contributed to Leo McLaughlin's mayoral campaign. Al Capone frequently visited Hot Springs in the 1920s, and he was really well known in the city's golf courses and in its clubs. This is Al and George Meyer, who was rumored to be the wheelman in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and then Ralph Bottles Capone, Al's brother, and that's the three of them in Hot Springs at a place called Happy Hollow, which was kind of a goofy amusement park in Hot Springs. You can see they're wearing sombreros or something. Capone used to take the waters in Hot Springs as well to treat his syphilis, and venereal diseases was actually one of the more popular ailments that people came to Hot Springs to treat with the baths. And in 1927, the same year that McLaughlin got elected mayor of Hot Springs, Capone was vacationing in Hot Springs with his brother and with his entourage. And a guy named Vincent Schemer Drucci, who was a hitman for Chicago's North Side gang, decided he was going to try to collect the $50,000 bounty on Al's head. So he followed him down to Hot Springs, and one night he found Capone driving alone on the street, and he shot up his car with buckshot with a shotgun, but somehow Al jumped out of the car and rolled into a ditch, and he survived the attack. Now, after McLaughlin was able to open Hot Springs up, the town really just got more and more popular, and it became a haven for celebrities, for athletes, for prize fighters. This is a picture of Jack Dempsey there on the far left, and Estelle Taylor and Rudolph Valentino eating at the Arlington Hotel in Hot Springs. And this was a pretty popular site. I mean, all of the top celebrities in the country were frequently visiting Hot Springs during this time. But also a lot of the Capone mob were frequent guests as well. Frank Nitti, Jack Guzik, and Murray Humphreys was a big visitor to Hot Springs, and Murray would end up playing a pretty important role in the city later on. Leo McLaughlin, that's him again. He made good on all of his promises. He used all the money from gambling and liquor and prostitution to put up electrified streetlights in Hot Springs. He paved the roads. He fixed up buildings. Ironically, he even used the money to hire a lot more police and grow the police force. And he was a real gregarious figure. He used to dress in real sharp clothes. He wore a boater hat. He'd always have a carnation on his lapel. And he rode up and down the streets in a Viceroy carriage pulled by two horses, which is crazy because there were cars. I mean, he just did this to show off. I mean, this is a picture that was taken in in the early 1930s, but this is how he rode around town to attract attention to himself. But just like in the days of Frank Flynn, Leo here wasn't really the real power. It was this guy. This was the boss gambler. His name was W.S. Bill Jacobs. And when they got all the casinos back opened after McLaughlin was elected mayor, they needed a boss gambler to really kind of run things. That was kind of the tradition. That was the practice. And so they recruited Bill, who had a piece of a Faro game in Hot Springs at that time, to come down from Memphis and to really run the show. And he was so powerful that there's this kind of apocryphal story of Ralph Capone really berating Al because Al walked out on one of Jacob's clubs, this club called the Southern Club, without paying his marker. And Ralph was like, you can't, we'll never be able to go back to Hot Springs if you still Bill Jacobs. You got to go pay him. But Jacobs never drank, he never smoked, and he never even gambled. But he still ruled Hot Springs with a pretty iron hand, and he had a very clear set of rules. He limited how many casinos there could be. He made sure there were no bust-out joints. He made sure that all the customers could get a square game. But most importantly, he kept tabs on who had a piece of all the action, which meant that he kept all the outsiders out. And he didn't want to let people like the Capone mob have a piece of any of the casinos in Hot Springs. It all had to be folks that they knew, folks who were local, and he kept a piece of every club for himself. Now, in the early 1930s, all of these rules that Jacobs put into place would be put to a test in a big way with the arrival in Hot Springs of Owney the Killer Madden. And Owney, this is a picture of him when he was younger. He was originally from Leeds. He grew up in New York City's West Side, and he rose the ranks of a gang called the Gophers on the West Side to eventually become one of the leaders of the gang. He killed his first man at the age of 17, and he went on to kill at least 6 more people and take at least 9 bullets in his gut along the way as he rose in power in New York's underworld. And eventually, Owney Madden, along with Frank Costello and Big Bill Dwyer, became the top of New York City's largest rum-running operation, and he had fleets of boats and trucks that moved rum up and down the East Coast. And so the three of them became rich and powerful, and Owney went on to run the famous the Cotton Club, where he managed the careers of Duke Ellington and George Raft and Mae West and Primo Carnera and many other stars and athletes. Now in 1931, this guy, Vincent Mad Dog Cole, was terrorizing New York City's underworld by kidnapping gang leaders and holding them for ransom. And this is all depicted in the movie The Cotton Club, if you've ever seen Coppola's film The Cotton Club. But after a meeting between Costello and Madden and Lucky Luciano and others, it was decided that Owney would be the one to take care of this guy. So he arranged for Cole to take a phone call from him at a drugstore on West 23rd Street, and that's where one of Owney's men lit him up with a machine gun and killed him. And after the hit, the word got out around New York that Owney was behind it, so the state sent him to prison on kind of an old charge that he had. And in the time that Owney was away in prison, really the whole world changed. Congress passed the Blaine Act, Prohibition ended, and the Depression was really in full swing. And the mob in New York changed a lot during the time that Owney was away too. Power had really consolidated among 3 young leaders. You see here Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano, but also Bugsy Siegel. And those 3, along with Frank Costello, they somehow were able to juice the governor of New York to get Owney out of prison. But the deal was that he'd have to leave the state. So they suggested that he should go and lay low in Hot Springs, Arkansas, because the mob was paying pretty close attention to what was happening down there and the sort of developing gambling interest in Hot Springs. And the mob was interested in Hot Springs because now that Prohibition was over, they'd really lost their largest source of revenue. And so gambling and prostitution was really what was left to keep them kind of in high cotton. And there were a lot of large-scale illegal gambling operations in America around that time. But Hot Springs was really unique because it was so big and it was really free of any mob influence at that point. Plus, Meyer Lansky, he traveled to Hot Springs frequently because his son, Buddy, had spina bifida, and the doctors had prescribed him to take the baths. And so Meyer would travel to Hot Springs frequently with his son to take the baths, and he would be there for weeks and sometimes months at a time. So Lansky and company gave Owney an interest in this place, the Tropical Park Racetrack in Florida. This track once belonged to Dutch Schultz, but they had him murdered, and so they gave Owney his racetrack, and the idea was that Owney would use this proceeds from this racetrack to kind of get himself set up down in Hot Springs. And so when Owney arrived in town, he deposited $2 million into the Bank of Arkansas, which was reportedly the largest deposit ever made in that bank ever. So he definitely showed up and made quite a splash, but the money really didn't do any good. Owney did a pretty good job of cozying up to Leo McLaughlin, who really was enamored by him and really loved the idea of having kind of a mob ambassador there in Hot Springs and kind of a quasi-celebrity that was going to live in Hot Springs. But Jacobs, who was the real decision maker in town, really nixed the idea of Owney getting any piece of the action. But Owney didn't leave town. He met the postmaster's daughter, a woman named Agnes Demby, and he fell in love and he got married. And Owney became a permanent resident of Hot Springs. He ended up living in Hot Springs for the rest of his life. Now, in 1936, Lucky Luciano, he was the most wanted man in America. Tom Dewey in New York he had issued a warrant for his arrest for white slavery charges for running this huge prostitution ring in New York City. And when Luciano caught wind of this, he was able to skip town before he could get arrested. And there was like a nationwide, dragnet looking for him. But where he went was he grabbed a car, he picked up his girlfriend, Garilova, and the two of them drove down to Hot Springs to lay low because Owney had ensured them if they came to Hot Springs, the local police and the local political establishment would protect him. And so for 2 weeks, Lucky and Gay really wined and dined and lived it up in Hot Springs. They played golf, they gambled. And then totally by pure chance one day, a police detective from New York was in town investigating some other case or something, and he was strolling down the street, and he runs smack dab into Lucky Luciano strolling down the street side by side with the chief of police detectives having a grand old time. And so the New York cop says to Lucky Luciano, hey, do you know that there's a warrant out for your arrest in New York? And Lucky Luciano told that cop to stay out of it. So the cop goes and he calls Tom Dewey, who calls the governor of Arkansas, and eventually the local police in Hot Springs were forced to take Luciano to jail. But, they told him everything's going to be okay, we're going to take care of you, and they immediately arraigned him and they let him out on bail. And when Dewey heard that they let Luciano out on bail, he was enraged. He called the governor of Arkansas again. He said, you got to send someone else to arrest him. You can't use the local police. You got to send the state police. So the state police went back to rearrest Luciano. They held him in the local jail, but there was a big standoff between the Arkansas State Police and the Hot Springs Police where they all pointed their guns at each other and had this big standoff over who was going to take Luciano. And they were waiting for all these different courts to weigh in and decide who would get jurisdiction over this guy. And the Hot Springs courts and the Hot Springs Police were committed to keeping Lucky Luciano so they would not have to turn him over to New York police. But eventually, the governor of Arkansas, Marion Futrell, Dewey was able to actually put a lot of political pressure on him. Now, Futrell was a friend of the gamblers in Hot Springs. He had taken a blind eye to gambling for his whole career. His whole attitude was, gambling's a local issue. If they don't ask me for any help, it's not my business what goes on down there. And he was a friend to all the gambling owners. They made sure they took care of him. But his attorney general was a guy named Carl Bailey, and Bailey was gunning for his job. So Bailey was really using this as an opportunity to grandstand, and he was making a bunch of speeches about Arkansas being a haven for criminals. And so Bailey ordered that the state police go down there, take Lucky Luciano, and give him up to the New York police. They did it with machine guns, and eventually, he was put on a train and taken back to New York. And Bailey used this entire incident to gin up his own run for governor. He claimed that gangsters had made Arkansas into a safe haven. He said he would be the man to clean it all up. And he also said that there was a gangster who lived in Hot Springs who offered him a $50,000 bribe to let Lucky Luciano go free, presumably Owney Madden. Now, after the national publicity from this whole ordeal, Jacobs tightened the grip on Hot Springs, but it really wouldn't matter because once Bailey won and became governor, he started raiding all the clubs, shutting them down, and he'd haul all the tables and the slot machines to Little Rock, piled them up in a big pile in front of the state capitol and lit them on fire and burned them, and got as much publicity out of this whole thing as he could. But even that didn't last because after Leo McLaughlin and some other gambling leaders went to meet with the new governor in Little Rock, Bailey told the press that gambling in Hot Springs was a local issue, and it was none of his business, and all the clubs opened back up. So the House won yet again. Now, in 1940, after Bill Jacobs died unexpectedly, Owney finally had his opening. And rather than appoint a new boss gambler for the town, Leo McLaughlin kind of decided he'd be the boss gambler himself. And he gave himself the authority to decide who could buy into which club, who could run a casino. And then he took over Jacobs' interest in all the clubs. So Leo McLaughlin really decided it was time to get his and be the boss he always really wanted to be and not kind of be like a figurehead. And McLaughlin wasn't as discriminating as Bill Jacobs. He allowed a lot of new clubs to open up, and he also allowed Owney to purchase shares, including in the flagship club, the Southern Club. And so during this time, Owney really starts to rise in stature in Hot Springs and becomes a really important person. He holds court at the Southern Club every day, sitting at a table in the cafe where people could come and ask him for favors, ask him for help. And he really starts to play the role, even though McLaughlin's kind of the boss gambler, of the boss gambler. And really becomes like a local celebrity. Media starts to come to Hot Springs just to see Owney Madden, to interview him about his new life. This is a cool picture of him in a Chris Craft boat on Lake Hamilton in Hot Springs. This boat was given to him as a gift by the actor George Raft. But you can see he's entertaining people who are clearly from out of town, and he was really a big deal during this period of time. Now, World War II really becomes a boom time for Hot Springs. This building on the far left here, this is the Army-Navy Hospital, and this hospital became a receiving hospital for all the soldiers that were returning from World War II. Not just the ones that were injured, but really every soldier that was coming back home had to spend a certain amount of time at this hospital while they kind of got processed or whatever and were sent back home. And so for this whole section of the southwestern section of the country, this hospital was the sort of receiving place for them. It was such a big deal that this place on the right here, that's the Eastman Hotel, which was a big hotel in Hot Springs, was commandeered by the federal government so that soldiers could live there too. So you could imagine how this huge influx of soldiers coming in for just weeks at a time would really be a boon time for a place that's business was hospitality. In a lot of ways, this really mirrors what's happening in Las Vegas with the dam and the people that show up in Las Vegas to build the dam and how that created this influx of folks to gamble and do what all else in Las Vegas. That's what was happening after World War II in Hot Springs, and it really got the motor going. But the other thing that happened during that same period of time was that the veterans that came back from World War II, the sort of young veterans that came back, they wanted to get involved in politics. And they wanted to take the reins from kind of the aging leaders like Leo McLaughlin, who really at this point had been mayor for nearly 20 years. And so they felt it was their turn to run the city, but McLaughlin wasn't ready to give up power, and he really ran a political machine. He rigged every election in Hot Springs. He collected poll tax receipts, he stuffed ballot boxes, and he handpicked everybody from in every office all the way down to dog catcher, because it was important that every single person be in the combination, as they would say, so that the whole thing could run like a well-oiled machine. The judges, the clerks, everybody had to be in on the gambling operation, and everybody got a piece of it. And one person elected to office in Hot Springs could upset the whole apple cart. So that's why the machine was important. And he wasn't ready to let any of these young veterans get in on the action. So they decided they were going to run against him, and a group of the veterans formed a group called the Government Improvement League. It was a coalition of candidates who were all veterans, and they would wear their uniforms when they would campaign. They compared McLaughlin to Hitler, and they had a wild campaign. They would carry guns in the streets, and both sides would threaten each other with guns. People stole from each other's campaigns. And this building that they're standing in front of, you can see it's a Buick dealership. This was Raymond Clinton's Buick dealership. This was their campaign headquarters. They said this place was just filled with shotguns. That was kind of their campaign equipment, just rows and rows of shotguns. And they would drive around the streets with guns to make sure that voters weren't being intimidated. Interestingly enough, Raymond Clinton, the man who owned that Buick dealership, was the future uncle of Bill Clinton, who, believe it or not, a lot of people know that Bill Clinton's from Arkansas. He made a big deal about being from Hope because he was born in Hope, Arkansas, and that sounds really beautiful. But he moved to Hot Springs when he was 6 years old, and he grew up and graduated from Hot Springs High School. He was very much a product of the Sin City of the South. So Owney saw this happening, and he saw the writing on the wall, and he split with Leo McLaughlin, and he joined up with these guys. And after a bruising campaign and later a legal battle, these guys won. They took over, the reformers took control of the local government, and Owney was one of the few kind of gambling leaders who was on the inside with the new administration, the new combination as it was. Now around this same time, the National Crime Syndicate had wrestled control of the race wire away from coast to coast. This was the race wire. There's an exhibit here in the museum about it, and the wire was built by a man named Moses Annenberg. He was kind of a newspaper tycoon. And the race wire was important because it connected all the bookmakers around the country with instant race results. And Murray Humphreys eventually was able to wrestle control of it away from Moses Annenberg by having the man who ran it murdered. They shot him in broad daylight in a Chicago street, and when they found out he survived the shooting, they went to the hospital where he was being held, and they stuffed a fistful of mercury bichloride tablets in his mouth to finish the job. And the reason why they did all that, the reason why it was so important for them to get control of this race wire, was it was really a crucial piece of technology. I mean, it allowed bookmakers to pay and collect on the same day rather than waiting a couple of days for results to show up in the newspapers. And control over this network of wires was kind of like an early version of the internet, right? I mean, it was a network of hijacked Western Union lines, and information could be relayed almost anywhere in almost real time. So whoever used it, whoever controlled it, could use control of this wire to leverage themselves over, leverage a percentage of every bet that was made in America. And so once the mob had control of the race wire, it was a gold mine. It was a way for them to really not only like sell access to the wire, but get a piece of the action everywhere in America. And once Murray Humphreys got control of the wire, he gave Owney Madden the right in Hot Springs to control the race wire in Hot Springs. And so this really put Owney in the catbird seat. It gave him a lot more, even more power than he had before in Hot Springs. He could sell access to the bookmakers, but he also could ask them for a piece of their business. And so Owney's influence grew during this period of time, and he really does become kind of the de facto boss gambler. At one point, Owney brings all the gambling leaders in Hot Springs down to Havana so that they could learn casino management from Meyer Lansky's casino managers in their casinos. And so he's really trying to shape Hot Springs into his own image of what Hot Springs can be. Now, this was around the same time that the Kefauver hearings start sweeping across the country in the 1950s. And gambling had really become a major problem in the United States. It was the single biggest source of revenue for the mob. Some estimates put it at about $9 billion a year. And the federal government realized that if they wanted to curb the mob's power and influence that they held over public life, they had to attack its source of revenue, which meant gambling. And the Kefauver Committee, and later the McClellan Committee, they traveled the country, they put on these hearings to investigate the mob. And every city that they went to, they would expose the sort of local illegal gambling operation and how that gambling operation funded political corruption and violence. And the reformers like the GI League in Hot Springs, they would then come in, clean house, and shut all these gambling operations down. And this is really the beginning of Hot Springs' real growth and influence in the American gambling industry. Because as each major illegal gambling center gets closed down in the wake of these Kefauver hearings in the 1950s, Hot Springs would only grow. There's this great map here in the museum that they've got on the wall of all the Kefauver hearings. And if you go look at it, you'll notice they didn't have one in Arkansas. There was never one in Arkansas. And that's because Hot Springs got really lucky here. Estes Kefauver, who was the chairman of this committee, he was a senator from Tennessee. But despite his vigor to dismantle the mob and their gambling operations, he was actually once a pretty avid gambler himself. In fact, Kefauver in his 20s lived in Hot Springs, and he was a teacher at Hot Springs High School. And during his time in Hot Springs, he racked up considerable gambling debts betting on horses with local bookmakers. And there's this one apocryphal story that Meyer Lansky's daughter tells, that the way that Meyer Lansky was able to avoid ever being called before the Kefauver hearings, which he wasn't, was that he called Owney Madden in Hot Springs, and he had Owney go around to all the local bookmakers and kind of build a dossier on all of Kefauver's markers and debts in Hot Springs. And then he met privately with Kefauver and showed him the information and said he'd go public with him if he had to testify. And he never had to testify, nor did he ever hold any hearings in Hot Springs. Now, in 1957, all of this work gets taken up by the McClellan Committee, which was ostensibly supposed to investigate mafia influence over the labor unions, but they also were looking at gambling and went after gambling as well. And what state was the senator, the chair of that committee, John McClellan, from? He was from Arkansas. And in the research I did for my book in FBI files, I found evidence that Hot Springs gambling leaders not only purchased McClellan's wife a new car, they actually bought 15,000 copies of Senator McClellan's book, which was ironically titled Crime Without Punishment. And those books sat in boxes in the back room of a casino and just sat back there and rotted. Not a single person ever read those, but I'm sure they helped get the book on the bestseller list. I wish somebody would have done that for my book, but... In later years, when Joe Valachi wrote his memoir, he claims that before he testified before the McClellan Committee, that Senator McClellan met with him privately, and he asked him to please, as a favor to him, not mention Hot Springs in any of his testimony. And he didn't. Now, this is a good picture, actually, on the left of Senator McClellan operating a holdout device. I just thought that was a cool picture. And I don't remember what this senator's name is, but I think he's using rose-colored glasses to look at Daub on the back of a card. So they did a lot of this kind of dramatic stuff where they were talking about how the mob would cheat people in gambling. So mobsters all over the country were frustrated by what was going on in Hot Springs. This is a picture of Newport, Kentucky, which Shakayla mentioned in her introduction. Newport was also a major gambling capital before the Kefauver hearings showed up, and they eventually shut down the gambling operations in that community. people were frustrated because they didn't understand why Hot Springs would get a pass while all of them were getting the high hat. And the fallout from all this was that while Hot Springs grew into a major destination, these other cities were really falling into violence and chaos in the wake of all these crackdowns because people were losing their livelihoods and they started fighting with each other to try to fight over whatever scraps were left. In Newport, white mobsters turned on black mobsters to take over their operations to make up for their lost revenue. In fact, this psychopath is a guy named Screw Andrews, and he was an Ohio mobster who started murdering black gambling bosses in Newport, Kentucky, and taking over their policy wheels and their numbers rackets. And one of those bosses, a guy named Skeet Coleman, who ran a big numbers operation in Newport, he ran and hid out in Hot Springs to hide out from Screw Andrews. But Screw tracked him down, and they found Skeet gunned down in his car, shot to pieces in one of the nicest neighborhoods in Hot Springs. In Kansas City, another gambling boss, this guy, Charles Mad Dog Gargata, he ended up murdered when it turned out that he was working as an informant for the committee's investigation of gambling rackets. And after he got killed, the committee found out that he was on the payroll at Owney Madden's Southern Club in Hot Springs. So the violence that was happening around the country in the wake of all these crackdowns was getting closer and closer to Hot Springs. The noose was sort of tightening. And with that meant that the heat was getting closer and closer to Hot Springs as well. And time again, even though the committee hadn't called any hearings on Hot Springs, neither committee ever had a hearing in Arkansas, people who were testifying for these committees kept mentioning Hot Springs. They were being asked about Hot Springs again and again. So it was just a matter of time before the federal government was probably going to step in and try to shut Hot Springs down. So the Hot Springs gamblers during the same time, they're in the midst of a real factional war. The locals who resented Owney's growing power and influence, they started running their own candidates to kind of upset that combination. And eventually a guy named Floyd Babe Huff got elected judge. And Babe Huff used his position as judge to shut everything down and demanded a 20% payment from every gambler in town and to have Owney completely cut out of every club that he was a part of and have him cut out of the business. And to insulate himself from Owney and Owney's mob connections, he brought in his own mob benefactor, this guy named Ralph Pierce from Chicago. And they formed a faction of club owners in Hot Springs who were opposed to Owney, and they started to demand that he sell his shares in local clubs. So Owney invited Frank Costello to come down to Hot Springs to try to help sort it all out. And Costello at that point was really running his own gambling empire that was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He had invested in slot machines. He had slot machines in clubs all over the country. And he came down and he spent 3 days in Hot Springs meeting with the gamblers, with political leaders, with restaurant owners, with cab drivers, really anybody that wanted to talk to him. And after he left, rumors were flying all around Arkansas that Costello was being recruited to be the new boss gambler of Hot Springs. And it made front pages all over Arkansas. So Costello ended up writing a letter to the editor of the Arkansas papers saying that he wasn't going to be the gambling czar, he wasn't interested in moving to Hot Springs. But Judge Huff made good on his threats, and he shut all the clubs down. And he used that as sort of a way to sort of turn the screws on all the gamblers so that they would turn on their ally with Owney Madden. And so in the end, Owney, after consulting with Murray Humphreys and with Frank Costello and his allies in Hot Springs, decided that he would back out, he would sell all of his shares in all the local casinos, but that he was going to keep the race wire. And that was kind of the compromise that they came to. And after that, they opened all the clubs back up and gambling got going back strong again. But some people really saw this as a weakness that Owney backed down the way that he did, and some people on the outside tried to test him. And this guy's name is Joe Peretto, and Joe Peretto was Carlos Marcello in New Orleans' underboss, and Joe ran gambling for Carlos Marcello down there, and he ran the wire for the mob in New Orleans as well. And they called him Papa Joe, and Papa Joe was friends with Owney. He had eaten in Owney's house. Agnes had cooked for him before. He had been his guest in town many times. But after this situation happened with Owney and Babe Huff, Papa Joe shows up armed and threatens Owney and says he's taking over control of the race wire in Hot Springs from Owney. And Owney and him have this big standoff, and the police come and get involved, and the police run Papa Joe out of town, and Owney gets on an airplane and he flies to Chicago to talk to Murray Humphreys and Sam Giancana, and he asked them to kill him. And they said, I think you should kill this guy. He's giving me a problem, which they weren't going to do. There's, really great wiretap. It's the FBI and all of their violation of all these guys' civil rights really gave writers like me a gold mine by recording all these conversations. But there's great phone conversations between Murray Humphreys and Sam Giancana and Ralph Pierce talking about all this and how they didn't think it was fair that Peretto should take over Owney's business. At this point, Owney is kind of an aging gangster, right? And the only reason they're letting Owney continue to have this, even though some of these younger gangsters around him want to take it from him, was out of this kind of begrudging respect for Owney as a legend, as kind of a living legend. And Murray Humphreys really had a soft spot for Owney, so they ended up telling Papa Joe to back off and let Owney keep the race wire. But the reason the story is important is that as the government's listening to all this on wiretaps and watching this go down, Bobby Kennedy, later as Attorney General, uses this story when he goes to testify before Congress because he wants Congress to pass a whole suite of laws to allow the Justice Department to crack down on illegal gambling around the country. And he needs them to pass these laws to make certain things federal crimes that weren't federal crimes at that point. And he tells them this story about Owney Madden and Papa Joe and Murray Humphreys to illustrate the way that gamblers and gangsters were crossing state lines, not only to transact bets, but to plan murders and to plan violence against each other. And it works, and they pass the laws, and it really makes it much more difficult for gamblers in the 1960s to run illegal operations. Now, despite the deal that Owney cut with Judge Huff, Owney was secretly backing a guy named Dane Harris, a local man who was in the liquor business, in a pretty ostentatious venture called the Vapors. And the Vapors was inspired by all the sleek and modern clubs that Dane had seen in Las Vegas in the late 1950s. And in time, the Vapors became the most successful club in Hot Springs by far, and Dane Harris and Owney really masterminded the political ouster of Judge Huff and put their own new kind of political combination in power in Hot Springs. In the 1960s, Dane became the boss gambler, and Owney kind of became the man behind the man. And Hot Springs at that time began to rival Las Vegas for visitors every year and gambling revenue. But then the revolution in Cuba really brought the mob and the gambling industry to an important crossroads. This is a picture of right after the revolution, and you can see the revolutionaries have drug the slot machines out in the street and lit them on fire, which is the same thing they did in Arkansas and time again, which I thought was kind of a good image. Prior to the revolution, Meyer Lansky believed that Havana was going to be the mob's future. He thought that this was a place where they could really create their own Monte Carlo, that they could have this paradise on earth, that they could make lots of money, they wouldn't have to look over their shoulders for fear of prosecution from overzealous political reformers or anything like that. But then the revolution really put all those dreams to rest, and it put Meyer Lansky to an important decision. Where should they invest all the time and money that they had put into Havana? Well, at that point in time, there were really only two choices, Las Vegas and Hot Springs. And while Meyer Lansky supposedly hated Las Vegas, he liked that Nevada had legal gambling. And Dane and Owney Madden understood this, and in the early 1960s, they started working overtime to try to legalize gambling in Arkansas. They knew that that was the only thing standing between them and getting essentially $250 million in loans from this Teamster Central State Pension Fund. So they really pumped a lot of money into advertising campaigns to get locals in Arkansas to support legalizing gambling in Hot Springs. They paid off legislators. They hired polling firms. But it wasn't going to be easy because Arkansas politics during this period of time was dominated by Baptists, and the state's most pressing issue at that time was desegregation. And the Little Rock Central High School crisis had really consumed the state, and it was by far the dominant issue of the day. Governor Orville Faubus, he had stoked all those fires to keep himself in office. And while Faubus was a supporter of all the gamblers down in Hot Springs, they sent him $50,000 to $75,000 a year in payoffs at a time when the governor of Arkansas' salary was $10,000 a year. He still needed the frothing at the mouth racists in Arkansas to stay in office. And so quickly, those Baptists moved from segregation to gambling and liquor, and they demanded that Faubus shut down the casinos in Hot Springs. Now, so Owney and his faction, they're spending money trying to get the right people elected and polling all the population, and while they're doing all that, Las Vegas is growing by leaps and bounds, and it's just leaving Hot Springs in its dust. And the Teamster Central State Pension Fund, who's funding a lot of that growth in Vegas, they were still kind of hedging their bets, and at least a little bit, and they were funding the development of new hotels in Hot Springs during that same time. And they were building these big, ostentatious hotels in Hot Springs, but they were leaving space empty in the hotels on the promise that gambling would be legalized there and they could run casinos out of them. But not everybody in Hot Springs wanted to legalize gambling. A number of people in Hot Springs were getting wealthy off the fact that it was illegal. I mean, at that time in Hot Springs, you'd get paid off just by being the dog catcher, just by being the brother of somebody that was a county clerk meant that you could get to have slot machines in your barbershop or your restaurant or something like that. And if they legalized gambling, there was no more graft, and a lot of these people would lose their revenue. So there was a good number of people in Hot Springs who thought the idea of legalization was unpopular. It was not something that they wanted to see happen. And so a rival faction of politicians and gamblers formed. And so this is like, the same story happening over and over again. And they ran candidates against Owney and Dane's candidates to further complicate the situation. And when that didn't work and they couldn't get their candidates elected, they tried a different tack. This is a picture of the Vapors after it was bombed in 1963. Starting in 1963, a bombing campaign swept across Hot Springs. The Vapors was bombed. It injured dozens of people. It paralyzed one woman and it killed another. The prosecuting attorney's car was bombed in his driveway. A local judge's car was bombed. And Dane's house was even bombed. In addition, a local black church, the Roanoke Baptist Church, the oldest black church in Hot Springs, was burned. And the FBI believed that the same group that was behind the bombings was behind the arson, because they got a tip in advance that this was going to be one of the places that they were going to go after. And the FBI thought that this was because the black community had supported Owney and Dane in all the local elections, but the truth was that they were just trying to do anything they could to bring any negative attention to Hot Springs. And up until this point, even though black church bombings and arsons were fairly common in the South at that time, Hot Springs had really avoided any of this kind of strife up until that point. And that's because the city was really home to a large and a vibrant black community that was buoyed by a strong middle class of black professionals and families who had relocated to Hot Springs from all over the country to work in the nightclubs, the casinos, and the hotels. And as a result, Hot Springs had a relatively more progressive relationship between the black and the white communities than most of the other cities in Arkansas. And this is a picture of what they called Black Broadway, which was Malvern Avenue in Hot Springs. And there's not a lot of great pictures of this part of town during that time, but the building that you see in the background, that large building, that was the Baptist Hotel, which was an important gathering spot. It was a major, massive, black-owned hotel. This is where the National Baptist Convention would hold their convention every year, which was the largest gathering of largest religious black gathering in America. They would meet there every year. There were a lot of important concerts that happened there. There were a lot of important conferences that happened there as well. And under Owney and Dane's leadership, Black Broadway also developed their own burgeoning and thriving gambling industry as well. Owney and Dane allowed African Americans to open up casinos and run gambling clubs there during the time that he was a boss gambler. And so this all made Hot Springs a really important tourist destination for black travelers and tourists. But all the bombings and all the fires that they had set, they all had their intended result. The governor, he couldn't ignore Hot Springs anymore, and in 1964, he ordered Dane and Owney to go around and shut all the clubs down. And on the eve of Easter Sunday, they held their last hurrah, and media from all over the world came to Hot Springs to see the last night that the clubs would be open. It was the eve of Easter Sunday, and people came from network television news. There were wire service reports that ran in newspapers all around the world the next day. And gambling continued to sputter along in Hot Springs kind of on the sneak after that, and really more in the open during the horse racing meet. But the last of the most stubborn holdout clubs, they didn't stop taking bets till probably 1971. And, there's a lot of great stories about how Governor Rockefeller, who ends up becoming the governor of Arkansas after Orville Faubus, he was from New York, but he had moved to Arkansas to get a divorce from his wife, because Arkansas and Nevada were the two states where you could get a quickie divorce during that time, which is another parallel between Hot Springs and Las Vegas's development, was how many people came there to get divorces. But he ended up staying and running for governor and became the first Republican governor of Arkansas since Reconstruction. And he was the one that really waged war on shutting down gambling in Hot Springs. And that's a whole other story and a whole other book, I think. But really, it wasn't until Owney Madden died in 1965. That really felt like the end of the era once Owney passed away. After Owney died, everything that went on after that was really just like I said, the stubborn holdouts, the last few clubs. So Owney dies in 1965, and over 250 people attend his funeral, including Papa Joe Peretto and Gyp DeCarlo and Jerry Catena, who was running gambling for the Gambino crime family. And among Owney's pallbearers was the mayor of Hot Springs, the chief of police in Hot Springs, and Carlos Marcello. And the state senator at the time, Q. Byram Hearst, he gave Owney's eulogy. And here's what he said. He said, "There is no ballpark named after Owen Madden, no silver cup bearing his name, but his name is written upon the hearts of all the people he helped with money, by deed, and by word of encouragement in their dark hours. It's been said that there is so much good in the worst of us and so much bad in the best of us that it doesn't behoove any of us to criticize the rest of us." And I'll close with this. It is true that nobody named any ballparks after Owney Madden in Hot Springs, and really maybe they should have, because he paid for most of them. He funded the boys' club. He paid to send the high school sports teams to tournaments. He donated money to build swimming pools. He provided athletic equipment to kids. And he ruled over Hot Springs during all these years without ever firing a single shot. He came to care about the community a great deal, and he lived there all the way to the end of his life. And after his funeral, when his widow went to donate money to their church for a stained glass window, they refused the donation and told her that her money was tainted. Things had changed in Hot Springs after he died, both politically and culturally. But I think the lack of a statue of Owney Madden really mattered, because a lot of this history of Hot Springs really got swept under the rug in the ensuing years. And it wasn't easy to piece all this together. It took me 5 years to write this book, and the research was really difficult because in the years preceding all of this, Hot Springs did everything they could to hide it, to obscure it, to reinvent themselves as kind of a family-friendly, pious destination for people. And I think that since Las Vegas succeeded where Hot Springs failed, Vegas more leaned into the history of what made the town what it was. I mean, they built a statue of Benny Binion. They gave the key to the city to Modellits, And I think that matters a lot because all this history was really in danger of being forgotten. And I think that that's for no good reason. I think that places like the Mob Museum matter a lot. I think that it's not about romanticizing crime or criminals. It's about really telling a true account of our history. And during this period of time in America, organized crime was incredibly influential and controlled a lot of American life. And gambling was the fuel that caused a lot of this to happen. And I think that by trying to pretend that it didn't happen, we were really in danger of forgetting our actual history in Hot Springs. And so I think we would have been worse off to not know it. But I'm glad that I was able to dig a lot of it up and find out how things really went down. And maybe one day they will put a statue of Owney Madden up in Hot Springs. I won't hold my breath, but we'll see. So thank you all for listening to me, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions for Mr. Hill? I can come right over to you. Pass the mic. Oh, here you go.
Hello.
Hi.
Bill Clinton was a straight-laced kid and very religious. Sunday morning he'd get up and get washed and dressed, put on a suit, and walk a mile to church with a Bible on his hip. Meanwhile, his mother, Virginia, and Roger were sleeping it off upstairs. Can you speak a little bit about Virginia and Roger Clinton?
Sure, yeah. So Bill Clinton's mom, Virginia, she was a wild woman, and everybody in Hot Springs knew her. She was a regular in all the clubs and casinos in Hot Springs. She was a regular at the Vapors, and she was somebody who liked to dance on top of tables and bar tops, and she was a lot of fun. People really liked her. But I talk about her in my book a little bit, too, and one of the characters in my book is my own grandmother, Hazel, and my father and Bill were born on the same day. They were the same age. They grew up in the same neighborhood, and they went to school together, and they were both they were both the sons of single mothers who were victims of domestic violence and who both really enjoyed the nightlife of Hot Springs and really enjoyed having a good time. But Hazel really succumbed to that life in Hot Springs. And that's the part of the story I tell in my book is how she really became addicted to drugs and alcohol and had a really hard life. And Virginia didn't, Virginia was able to keep it together. And I think that's an important contrast that I wanted to make in the book to show that, not everybody was a victim of this life in this community, that some people were able to actually come out of it on the other side, having had a great time and having raised a future president of the United States. But there's also a great story that Bill Clinton, he was a saxophone player, and his mother took him to the Vapors to see some famous jazz saxophonist play, and that Bill was so, uncomfortable being in the Vapors, knowing that it was illegal or whatever. He didn't like it. He never wanted to go back there again. So he definitely cut quite a contrast to his mom, who he loved very much, but they were definitely different people, yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are there any other questions? Yep, I can come right over to you.
Thank you. Fantastic talk.
Thank you.
You mentioned that the city didn't want a lot of this history to come out. Did you face any resistance or threats or anything like that during your research?
Not really any threats, but what I did experience was a lot of people who were nervous about talking to me, nervous about the fact that I was writing the book. And there was still this feeling in Hot Springs that you shouldn't talk about these things, right? That people wanted to know why I wasn't changing people's names. Why would I, and people would always say, like, is anybody getting mad at you for telling the story? So I think among some of the old timers in Hot Springs, they don't understand that, like, a lot of time has passed and people are kind of over it now, and they still felt like there might be repercussions for telling some of these tales out of school. But now that the book is out and in the world, I've seen that the reaction has been positive. And people I lived in Hot Springs for a year while I was writing this, and people who during that time refused to talk to me, would not talk to me at all for the book. After the book came out, were like sending me emails saying, I wish I had talked to you. Like, I think that, it's good that the book came out. I think it's chilled a lot of people out about this idea that this is all very taboo and we shouldn't talk about it. And Hot Springs is really a much different place now. It's really, one of the great ironies is that Hot Springs fought legalizing gambling in the 60s. Then again in the 1980s, Dane Harris's child tried to legalize, his son, Dane Jr., another campaign in the early 80s to legalize gambling in Hot Springs. That failed again. They tried again later in the early 90s. That failed. Now, finally, the state passed a measure just, I think, 2 years ago to legalize gambling, and there's a $100 million casino at the racetrack now. So it's like, it happened way too late. Now there's gambling in 40 different states. If they had done it in 1960, we wouldn't be sitting in Las Vegas right now, probably. We'd probably be sitting in Hot Springs. So they missed the boat on that. But yeah, I think that people are starting to realize that they can talk openly about these things, and maybe probably even should, that it's something that people around the country are curious about. It's a novelty, and it makes people interested and intrigued in this little tiny national park down in Arkansas.
Good fodder for a second edition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Okay, another round of applause for David Hill, author of The Vapors. Thank you so much. As a reminder, we are selling a few books at the concession stand, and David Hill will be here at this table right behind me to sign them as well if you are interested. And thank you all for coming here tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.